Welcome to the Educational Physics Podcast. I am your host, João Figueiredo. This is Season 3 of the Educational Physics Podcast. I hope to speak about many issues. I hope to speak to guests about many issues. And I hope that we together can discuss the future of education in an honest and open way. Consider subscribing, liking, sharing, and commenting. Your feedback and support is much appreciated. Thank you for listening. Welcome to another episode of the Educational Physics Podcast. Today, it's episode 3 of Season 3, and we will continue our discussion on learner-centered education. If you've watched the previous episode, you know that I will be tackling this model for education from very different, or many different angles, I should say. Last week, we addressed the evolutionary angle. Today, I want to talk about the psychological angle. Why is it psychologically beneficial for children and adults, for all that matters, to learn from a learner-centered perspective? So from a psychological front, we have to understand how this links to a couple of things. One being human nature. Okay, how does learner-centered education link to human nature, society, or our societal rules? How does it all come together? First and foremost, like we said last week, we are wired to learn, right? This is something that we just do naturally. It's part of our evolutionary system. Without that, I would say, genetic predisposition to learning, we would not have survived as a species. We don't have the physical fitness that allows us to survive against bigger predators. What has turned us into an apex predator is indeed our capacity for learning and adaptation and experimentation. And so that already tells us a lot about the human psychology. One of the things that we will have to understand is that from the standpoint of a human being, learning is always the product of experience and experimentation. Real learning. I'm not talking about rote learning where, you're just, information is thrown at you, and all you're expected to do really is to memorize that for about a week and then regurgitate everything onto a test or exam, and then you can let go of the information. I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about actual functional learning. Functional learning meaning things that you can use in your day-to-day life, right? And what we need to understand is why learner-centered education is so attuned to the way we operate in the world. So a child learns language through exposure to language, right? We don't teach children when they are babies and toddlers academically. We don't teach their mother tongue with that sort of approach, as we do then with second and third languages once children go to school. So what's going on there? The child is still being able to learn, and it's not necessarily in a very structured way. Well, the child is effectively experiencing one of its first learner-centered educational experiences. The parents speak to the child, and I'm a big believer as a parent that we should never speak to children with those baby voices and stuff like that, because it does babyfy their experience. The tone should be kind and appropriate for each situation, but never really with like goo goo dada sort of vibes. Um, and so when the child in this case is exposed to language from that perspective, where the parents are talking directly at the child, not just talking amongst those who already speak the language, but we actually, in a way, ignore the fact that the child cannot respond verbally, and we still communicate verbally, right? We don't go down to the level of their communication. We rise them by constantly exposing them to that, in this case, that language, that field of learning and knowledge. And this is a 100% learner-centered education approach, but at a very natural level, right? Meaning we're not too worried about it, if they're going to pass the grades. That's not the point. The point is to make it functional. And eventually the child learns how to speak fluently by age 2 or 3. And so, what is it about the child's psychology that's allowing them to absorb all this information? Well, there's a lot here. So let's talk about the brain-based education angle as well, which will bring the psychology into it. Our brains are wired to create neural pathways. If you know the basics of psychology, you know that our brains have evolved to become these learning machines, but also to become these memory machines. And so our brains are divided into multiple different sections, which allow us to segment and sectionize, if that's even a word, the different functions of the brain. So we have, for example, the temporal brain, which takes care of your oral skills. We have the occipital brain, or section of the brain, which takes care of your visual skills and processing what the visual stimuli means, right? Because that's important here. The brain does a lot of meaning decoding. So the stimuli comes in, and the brain works out, what does this mean? And what do I already know about this? Because we are also wired for detecting patterns. And the brain is constantly trying to understand what the environment means. So here's a very strong word for today's podcast, right? Meaning. Psychologically speaking, it is much more beneficial for a human being to understand and learn something. Is much more, not just beneficial, but more efficient if we assign meaning to it. Okay, so let's talk about how to develop memories. Right, so let's take the academic approach. You're trying to learn something for an exam. What is the best way for you to do this, right? Well, psychologically, rote education is, like I said already earlier, is that kind of, it's just injection of information. It sticks there for a while, and as soon as it comes out, because we fulfill the task that we had previously assigned for that chunk of information, which is, you're useful to me for that exam. So we are assigning a task. Once the task is fulfilled, that information becomes obsolete and we get rid of it. And this also has a name in psychology. It's called pruning. And so if that's the only task we assign to that chunk of information, like I said, once it's completed, we prune away and we get rid of it so we can allow space for other pieces of information to come in. Now, evidently, this is not good. It's not a very efficient way of learning, and it doesn't make the learning process even fun or useful in the long run. So what do we want to do? We want to make sure that we trigger psychological hacks, if you will, in order to allow us to learn long term. Now you might say, yeah, but I've never really had to use fractions in my day-to-day life. And that's fair. What we need to look at things is from a more meta perspective. So in other words, yes, you might not use fractions, but the fact that you've understood fractions when you were tool to understand them, allowed your brain to work out new ways of solving problems. And we do a lot of transferring of skills. So different situations will trigger different skill sets. And it doesn't have to look exactly the problem, that is, doesn't have to look exactly the same as it did when you learned about that field, say fractions. Um, for me, because my background is as a musician, I can guarantee you that all the techniques that I've learned on the drum kit, I've used them, the same technique, in 1,000 different ways. And that's what technique is all about. So, what is that kind of learning? Well, let's call this episodic learning or episodic memories. So, what the goal is to create a scenario, a situation where these pieces of information become applicable, even if it's an imaginary scenario. So, rather than just giving children and adults these tasks for them to fulfill, let's create scenarios, real life scenarios, where indeed people will have the ability to contextualize the information. That makes all this the information that they are trying to acquire much more accessible when needed, because we will remember the situation rather than just the information. It's a classic example of trauma, isn't it? If you're traumatized by something, and I'm not going to talk about trauma at the level of incapacitating trauma. Let's just talk about regular trauma that we all have. Some people are afraid of spiders, some people are afraid of heights. That all stems from trauma, right? Well, we hold on to that trauma precisely because not only we learned the information that falling off a high building it kills you. Yeah, we know that, but we've associated a moment in life to that piece of information. That's what creates the fear, right? It comes together as a compounded idea, emotional response. So that's the limbic system plus, I guess, prefrontal cortex stuff, which reasons and says, yeah, okay, if I fall off that building, I'm gonna die. That makes sense to me. It's not even right that it's a prefrontal cortex. It comes most likely before that. But either way, point being, we associate the episode to the information, we link those two together, and there you have it. You have an episodic memory. Now, this makes learning much more bespoke, much more individualistic, right? Because we're trying to associate information to situations that each student has experienced. That's more difficult to manage. So there's always an issue of scale, and we'll talk about this a lot on this podcast. The scale of these problems that we're trying to solve, right? We have massively distributed education. We have tremendous access to education, which arguably it's a great thing, right? Let's not debate that. But how do we manage the uniqueness of each student? It's very difficult to teach the same class 5 different ways. And I was having a conversation just a few days ago about this. I mean, is it efficient to teach this way? Extremely efficient. Is it feasible? Now, I would say currently, no. We are still at the level of theory. But I will recall something that we discussed here before on the podcast, which was my thoughts on, or which were my thoughts on, artificial intelligence and how it links to motivation. If we can give a specific scenario to each student in the room, but simultaneously by means of headsets, right? So each one of those students will be assigned a different scenario. Now, in the same time frame, you have multiple scenarios being ran at the same time. That's incredible. I think it's quite undeniable. If we can do that, every single one of those students will have its own bespoke experience. if these VR machines are linked to AIs who have had acquired enough information about each student to know exactly, okay, this student needs to be put in a situation where she's an artist and she's been now told to create a painting in the style of Picasso. Now that child is in that moment painting a Picasso, seeing it in front of her, and she sees like it's coming out similar or not, and the struggles and this and that. At the same time, the student next to that child on the same table is in Egypt exploring, the pyramids. And all of this in the context of, I don't know, a history lesson. I guess I'm mixing fields, but that's besides the point, right? I mentioned art first and then I went for history. So maybe it's art history. I'm not, it doesn't matter. The point is that we can, through technology, allow children to engage in situations that resonate with them individually, uniquely, and therefore then from there pull the broader concepts in learning, such as creative thinking, critical thinking. How do I solve this puzzle? How do I solve that problem? Where can I utilize the information I just learned in the class to this situation? So a lot of our capacity for learning comes from psychologically being able to engage with as many parts of our brains as possible, right? If we can activate the prefrontal cortex, as we know, develops quite late in humans. If we can, which we will discuss soon as to why that is. But if we can engage with the limbic system, which is the emotional core of our brain, if we can engage with, the temporal system, the occipital system, in these VR situations with headsets, yeah, they'll have the visual stimuli, they'll have the sonic stimuli, oral stimuli, however you want to call it. So we start to engage with all these different parts of the brain. They start to fire many more synapses, don't they? So psychologically, we are, well, I guess even physiologically, we are engaging at a much higher rate, and then psychologically creating a mental network of synapses that we will have access to at any given time. Now think about the power of that concept. It is just a fascinating idea to approach learner-centered education from the psychological front, so linking to brain-based education. So these two link quite well together, right? So learner-centered education is more the logistical side of things. Brain-based education is the more psychological, physiological aspect of all of this. But the brain-based child, I mean, is just a much more complete, comprehensive human being, because he or she will be able to constantly pull threads from many different directions. Unfortunately, as we speak, the educational system doesn't really even understand how to deal with children, say, who have this sort of diagonal thinking approach to the world. It's not so much the teachers who can't understand this. After all, we are humans and we can engage empathetically with other humans. Some people more, some people less, but we can, unless you're a psychopath. And so teachers can recognize that diagonal thinking. But the educational system, as we go a level up, struggles to understand what to do with those children, because the curriculum is not designed to be both understood and delivered diagonally. It's a very vertical approach, right? You go from point A to point B straightforwardly, and that limits things, right? So I would say that the more engagement we get in the brain, psychologically, the thicker the mental map will be, right? Because then I can associate all that information to my own personal experiences. So let's start to recap. I think that first and foremost, we need to understand how the brain learns from an educational perspective. Then we need to understand how humans learn as a species. That ties into what we talked about last week. We need to understand that, yes, there's all the different stages of development. Okay, the brain develops over time. So what should we be expecting from a human being at a specific point in time? Yes, we do deliver curriculum at I would say, progressive level, right? It starts quite simple for children in primary school. It becomes more and more challenging as we move on. But one thing that our educational system hasn't quite figured out yet is how to address the human side of things, the emotional side of things. How do we engage with the limbic system of each one of these humans, but also age ranges, right? Because they are different. Teaching a 5-year-old is not the same thing as teaching a 15-year-old. You're dealing with completely different emotional responses. I'm not saying necessarily that one response is easy, the other one is more difficult. But they are different. And knowing that will allow us to then override some of these issues, and at the end of the day, we will be able to empathetically and individually address each one of our students. So by understanding how the brain works, how people work, psychologically and physiologically, it will facilitate your it will facilitate your role in the learning process. And once again, by making the student the center of the process rather than you or the curriculum, which is what most people end up doing, by putting the student at the forefront of the process, then we will allow us to, and when I say us, I mean us even also as students. It will allow all of us to engage with the process at a much more, funny enough, meta way, but also more individual way, where we will both understand the fundamentals of human nature, but simultaneously we will also understand that each person is unique, each person has its own sets of needs and requirements. Each person learns through they have different points of entrance. So some people are more visual learners, others are more oral learners, others are read-write learners like myself, others are kinesthetic learners. They need to interact with things in a more tactile way. And so, can we cater for all of this in mainstream education? It's tough, unless we start to think about how to use technology to overcome the issue of scale. That's the only way I see this problem to be resolved in the next 25 years, let's say. It's by integrating and incorporating technology, such as AI and VR technology, into the classroom in order to expose students to different scenarios that are compelling to them, rather than just generic examples that mean nothing to 25 out of the 30 students in the room. That's my take on learner-centered education from the psychological perspective. I hope you enjoyed it. Next week, we shall continue this discussion with the philosophical angle of learner-centered education. Thank you for listening. And once again, if you enjoyed this, subscribe, share, comment, like, do the whole thing. Your support is truly important and appreciated. And so I'll leave you guys to do whatever you think you should be doing to support this podcast. We don't have donations or anything like that yet. Maybe one day. For now, just spread the word. I appreciate it. Take care and learn better. Bye bye.